Hello, students. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Evolution. And I'm going to share my screen on evolution with you. So the first thing on evolution, we need to know, what is evolution? How does evolution occur? So we're looking at the learning objectives. What is evolution is the first learning objective. What are the mechanisms that involve evolution? There are four mechanisms: mutations, genetic drift, theory of natural selection, and artificial selection. So evolution is derived from the term to evolve. Evolution is the process of change over time. For evolution to occur, organisms must adapt themselves to the changing environment. So we living organisms are constantly adapting ourselves in order to survive. And so we look at the next slide here. In evolution, like that, did you know? We're looking at this illustration which shows finches. What are finches? They are small species of birds. But in particular, this species of finches is referred to as the vampire finches. Now, who are vampires? Vampires are individuals who feed or suck the blood of another organism. And so these vampire fishes, they were living on the blood of another organism. Where do we find them? We find them in the Galapagos Islands. Now, who is Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin, as we can see in the next slide, he is called the father of evolution. And he was the biologist or scientist who coined the term evolution. He carried out several evolutionary experiments, or his research was conducted in the Galapagos Island. Where is the Galapagos? The Galapagos Island is in South America, particularly in Ecuador. And so when we look at the Galapagos Island, it is serving as a natural laboratory for studying all these different species of organisms, which you will never find anywhere else in the world. You see large, giant turtles in the Galapagos Island, different other species like vampire finches. And where did Charles Darwin? He was called a naturalist. He came aboard on the HMS Beagle, which was the ship that brought him to the Galapagos Island. And we see here that Darwin proposed his theory of descent with modification. I have put in a slide here. Charles Darwin, he published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection in the year 1859. And Darwin put forth his theory of natural selection. And he made two particular points. One was species descent with modification from common ancestors. To descent with modification, we have come from a pre-existing ancestor. Our ancestors unsurvived, and we have developed or made modifications, changes in our traits to suit our environment. The second main concept was the theory of natural selection. What is natural selection? It is a mechanism behind descent with modification, that we have all descended from a common ancestor. But in that descent, we have made a number of changes. So Darwin's theory explained the duality of unity and diversity. Although we share common characteristics with each other, we are yet so diverse or different. And so it was Darwin who, along with his friend or colleague called Alfred Wallace, put forth this natural selection. And this natural selection process is a non-random evolutionary process. Now, as we see, today we don't have the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are extinct. They were present in the Mesozoic. When you study evolution at a higher level, you see the Mesozoic or the Mesozoic era was the era in evolution where the dinosaurs are present. But why don't we have dinosaurs today? It's because they are extinct. Why are they extinct? Because they could not adapt themselves to the changing environment. And in order for organisms to adapt themselves, we must change. In order for organisms to survive, we must adapt ourselves to this environment that is constantly changing. So we look at this theory of evolution, which I talked about. Now we need to know that groups of organisms are evolving, they're changing when natural selection is going to favor individuals that have inherited traits that are very useful or beneficial. And so here now, we're looking at the different mechanisms on evolution. And evolution is occurring at the level of the population, but not at the level of the individual. So we're looking now to see the concept. What is the gene pool? What do we mean by gene pool? A pool is a sum of all the genes or genetic information that is carried by the individuals in a population. And this gene pool is influenced by 4 mechanisms: mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. So gene pool is being influenced by these 4 important mechanisms. So let us see now, what do we mean by DNA? So DNA, we look at the word DNA. What does DNA mean? DNA comes from the term deoxyribonucleic acid. So I'm going to insert a slide here, and I'm going to write down what DNA stands for. So DNA, let's go here. And so we can write down in the text here the DNA deoxyribonucleic acid. So when we see deoxyribonucleic acid, what does our DNA consist of? Our DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, it is a blueprint of the individual. It is the code of life, or the code of life. And this code of life, which is the blueprint of the individual, is unique to all organisms. No two organisms have the same genetic composition. So, going to the next one, save this so you have it here. How then are mutations introduced into genetic variation? We must know what then is a mutation. Pardon me, let's go back here. So DNA-based differences in observable traits make up the individual. When we look at genetic variation, they make up the genetic variation of the gene flow in a population, because you and I have different DNA sequences, and that is making up the genetic variation. It causes all of us to be different in our DNA. And this is how genes are going to flow in a population. What do we mean by gene flow? From the word flow, flow is the movement of genes from one population to another. Now, what's a mutation? A mutation is a sudden change brought about in the sequence of the gene. So when the genetic sequence changes suddenly, that's called a mutation. Now, mutations can be beneficial or they can be harmful. And mutations are a result of these random changes in our DNA sequences. So the beneficial mutations are the mutations that we require. For example, if you talk about the mule, it's a mule. It's a cross between a donkey and a horse. But when you look at harmful mutations are mutations that lead to cancer and all these diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, because there's a change in the sequence of the DNA. And that sudden change has caused these anomalies or abnormalities to occur, which leads to genetic diseases or genetic disorders. So new mutations that are inherited are going to change this overall genetic composition in a population, resulting in evolution. We have something called alleles. Alleles are two or more alternate forms of a gene. And when we look here now, how are mutations introduced? How they introduce genetic variation, various accidents. Mistakes can happen during the DNA replication process. What is replication? Replication is the process of making identical copies of DNA. And so, accidents can occur during the replication process. When the DNA molecules, they're going to collide with each other or with other molecules. When there's damage from heat or chemical agents, that causes a mutation. For example, cigarette smoke, nicotine in cigarette smoke, smoke in the air, smog due to the pollutants in the air, all the ultraviolet rays, the X-rays, that bring about a mutation or even cause cancer. So these are called mutagens. A mutagen is a chemical agent that causes a mutation to occur. And they can also lead to cancer, so they are referred to as carcinogens. So only mutations that occur in an organism's gametes can be inherited. What's a gamete? A gamete is our sex cells. So male sex cell is a sperm cell, female sex cell is an egg cell. So we talk about genetic drift, another mechanism that brings about evolution. And what do we mean by genetic drift? Drift is a change. So genetic drift, it's a random process that is causing the gene pool of a population to fluctuate randomly over time. And it can cause individuals that have a unique set of characteristics to die off. It can also allow individuals with different characteristics to survive and reproduce. But genetic drift is more likely to change or alter the gene pool of a small population than a large population. So it has an effect more on the small population than on a larger population. So what then is natural selection? What does natural selection do in a population? Natural selection, it generates adaptation. It creates adaptation. It causes adaptation. Natural selection, it's a non-random process. It shifts all the genetic traits or characteristics of the population only in one direction, and it leads to adaptation over successive generations. Now, individuals in a natural population, they are going to compete with each other for the limited resources, and it will help them to survive long enough to reproduce offspring. And so here now, in chapter 0, we talk about, which you will see in the e-version of your textbook, you will see we want to know about characteristics of living organisms. Very important. You'll be getting a lot of questions on characteristics of living organisms. So the first thing about characteristics of living organisms show order. And what is order? It is the organization or the order of, for example, petals in a sunflower, the way things are ordered. Secondly, we look at evolution. Another characteristic is evolutionary adaptation. The two terms, evolution and adaptation, are important. We just talked about evolution. It's change over time. And adaptation is essential for evolution to take place. Living organisms undergo regulation. So when we talk of regulation, we're looking at a main important concept called homeostasis. Now, how do we define homeostasis? Homeostasis is the process of maintaining a steady, stable internal environment. What is inside your body forms your internal environment. So immediately when you're looking at your internal environment, we're looking from the perspective of blood and your body temperature. Now, our body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, as well as we're going to look at what we call the pH of blood, which should be 7.4. Now, our body, on account of this homeostatic mechanism, if your body temperature fluctuates 1 degree Celsius or Fahrenheit, increase or decrease, you don't suffer from a fever or your temperature doesn't drop. And so you don't need to go to the doctors. But the moment it's more higher than that 1 degree, then you have to be worried. Let's look at living organisms' process energy. What is energy? Energy is the ability to work. And energy can be converted from one form to another. So energy exists in different forms. You have potential energy, energy that is stored. Every object has stored energy possessed in them. That is referred to as potential. You have kinetic energy. If I were to move my pen, roll it on the desk, you see that is kinetic energy in motion. Then you have solar energy, energy from sunlight, chemical energy, etc. So when the butterfly is sucking the nectar from the flowers, we see potential energy is now being converted into kinetic energy. If you look at photosynthesis, which only green plants undergo, sunlight energy is absorbed by the green plants and is now converted to chemical energy when the bonds are being broken down during photosynthesis. Let's go to living organisms grow and develop. So what is growth? Growth is an increase in the number and the size of cells. Development refers to the various stages of growth that an organism is going through, right from birth, infancy, toddlers, teenagers, adolescence, adulthood, and senility, which refers to old age. The next important characteristic would be organisms respond to the environment. You know, in English, we say for every action, there is a reaction. So if I pinched myself, I would say, ouch. So what is the scientific term I'm referring to? A stimulus is created. For every stimulus, there's a response. I pull my hand up, I say, ouch. So different organisms are responding differently. It should be LY. So different organisms are responding differently. For example, we have a particular type of plant which is called the Venus flytrap. And this Venus flytrap is a carnivorous plant. Very important term. A carnivorous plant is a plant that lives on the flesh of animals. Now, when an insect sits on this plant, this carnivorous Venus flytrap has small hair-like structures. So it senses the insect, which is the prey. Immediately, this plant is going to release enzymes that are going to swallow the insect, digest it. As characteristic, living organisms reproduce. What is reproduction? It's the process of producing children. We don't use the word children in biological terms. We call them offspring. So process of producing offspring of the same species. However, there are two types: sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. Now, when you talk of sexual reproduction, another term for sexual reproduction is referred to as meiosis. And towards the end of this chapter, we learn two different types of cell divisions, mitosis and meiosis. So what is meiosis or sexual reproduction? It's the union when the haploid sperm cell swims to meet the haploid egg. The sperm and the egg will unite and they form what we call the diploid zygote. Haploid comes from the word 1N, where N refers to the number of chromosomes. So 1 times 23 is equal to 23 chromosomes. So egg will have 23 chromosomes. I'm going to put here 23 chromosomes. And to form the diploid zygote, and the diploid zygote will be 2 times 23, which will be equal to 46. So the zygote, which is called the fertilized egg, has a total of 46 chromosomes. So this is important. So the organisms are going to undergo sexual reproduction. Some plants, not all plants, animals and fungi. Asexual reproduction, only one sex is involved, one parent is involved. For example, you have bacteria, you would have fern plants that reproduce asexually through spore formation. So this is important for you to understand. So what is speciation? It's splitting one species. You take a species and split it into 2 or more species. And therefore it leads to more diversity. How does speciation occur? It can be caused by geographic separation, also referred to as geographic isolation. And as time passes, the separated populations, they can accumulate many genetic changes so that they are not able to reproduce with each other anymore. And so how does evidence for biological evolution occur? How do we know that dinosaurs are no more extinct? Is because dinosaurs, which lived millions of years ago, through the evidence of fossil records. What are fossils? As we can see here, fossils are preserved or dead remains of both plants and animals. They were formerly living organisms, but fossil records enable biologists to reconstruct the history of life on Earth. Many intermediate species are going to exhibit some similarities to the ancestral group, to the organisms they came from, or some similarities to the descendant species. So when we look at a species, what then is a species? A species is a group of related organisms that are able to interbreed, interbreed, with each other and produce offspring that can reproduce. So we see now DNA evidence provides some of the most compelling evidence. And we know all living organisms contain the DNA, and we've said earlier, which is the genetic code. And we have all come from a common ancestor. So here, DNA evidence for evolution, what is it trying to show us? If you look, we are closer on this phylogenetic tree to the monkey. Now, when we do the blood typing, you see, towards the end, when we talk about blood types, you will see we can be either A, B, AB, or O, but positive comes from that word Rh factor. Rh is derived from this term called rhesus monkey. So we have inherited that factor from the rhesus monkey, which is a particular species of monkey. The difference between we humans and the rhesus monkey is we only have one single sequence that is different from the monkey, which is the human cytochrome C genes, mirroring the close morphology structure. If you compare a dog, there are 13 sequences different. So the dog is right lower down in the classification. On Thursday now, you will be learning in lab on taxonomy. And we see how we classify the organisms according to similarities and differences. So here, the most different organism as compared to us would be the moth. It has 36 sequences that are very different from us. And so let's look at what is artificial selection. It is the process by which only individuals with certain inherited characteristics can breed. The variation that humans have produced within dogs, ornamental flowers, many other species is showing the power of artificial selection. If there was no artificial selection, there wouldn't be evolutionary change. So artificial selection is pertinent to evolutionary change. And this shows the phylogenetic tree on artificial selection. So here, the last one here is scientists can produce new species through experiments such as the one that they created on this flower called the primrose in the early 1900s. And they have observed new species forming in nature. So there are clicker questions. You can go through the clicker questions. I hope you enjoyed the class.